He was the champion, untouchable, a blonde, mustachioed superhero who had turned a dying regional business into a national obsession. Everyone knew his name. Everyone bought his lunchbox. Everyone believed nobody could stop him. They were wrong. Because in one single year, the company he helped build would nearly consume itself. His best friend would betray him. A giant would vanish. A protege would try to unionize the locker room. And the entire industry would be transformed forever. The year was 1986. And the World Wrestling Federation was about to have the most reckless 12 months in wrestling history. In this video, we are breaking down the entire story of WWE in 1986. The three-city WrestleMania gamble that Vince McMahon bet the entire company on. The masked giant who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the year. The best friend who turned into the most hated villain in America. The failed union attempt that ended a career. And the moment, deep in the autumn of that year, when a man's throat was crushed against a steel guardrail, setting up what would eventually become the greatest match ever wrestled. In 1984, Vince McMahon had staked his father's company on one enormous bet. He was going to break the old territorial system. For decades, professional wrestling in North America had been carved up like a medieval kingdom. Every promoter had his region. Every region had its own stars. Nobody crossed the borders. Vince crossed all of them. He hired Hulk Hogan away from the American Wrestling Association. He signed Roddy Piper. He brought in Bobby Heenan. He bought out Georgia Championship Wrestling's TBS time slot on the infamous Black Saturday. And he took his product national, using syndicated television and an unlikely partnership with MTV to turn wrestling from a Saturday morning niche into a mainstream pop culture event. By 1985, that gamble had paid off. WrestleMania 1 had drawn 19,000 people to Madison Square Garden and beamed out to a closed-circuit audience across the continent. And when Dick Ebersol at NBC saw the ratings that WWE specials had been pulling on MTV, he made Vince an offer nobody else in wrestling could match. NBC agreed to preempt Saturday Night Live several times a year to air a WWE special called Saturday Night's Main Event. So heading into 1986, the World Wrestling Federation was not just a wrestling company anymore. It was a media empire. Championship Wrestling and All-Star Wrestling ran on Saturday. All-American Wrestling ran on Sunday. Primetime Wrestling ran on Tuesday on the USA Network. TNT, the mock talk show Vince himself hosted, ran on Wednesday. Saturday Night's Main Event ran on NBC every 8 weeks. And the touring schedule underneath it all was punishing. 3 shows a day sometimes. Wrestlers were being pushed to the absolute limits of what a human body could endure. And at the top of it all sat Hulk Hogan. Hogan had won the WWE Championship from the Iron Sheik on January 23, 1984. By the time 1986 began, he had held that title for nearly 2 years without a single loss. He was untouchable. He was invincible, the biggest star the wrestling business had ever produced. But the problem with being untouchable is that eventually, somebody has to touch you. A champion nobody can beat is a champion nobody wants to watch. The man Vince chose to threaten Hogan first was a bald 450-pound monster from Atlantic City. His name was King Kong Bundy. And on the March 1st edition of Saturday Night's Main Event, taped in Phoenix in the middle of February, Bundy was going to launch the storyline that would carry the WWE into the biggest event of its young life. The setup was simple. Hogan was scheduled to defend his championship against Don Morocco. Bobby Heenan, Bundy's manager, was seconding Morocco in the match, filling in for a supposedly ill Mr. Fuji. Hogan won the match by disqualification when Heenan interfered. And then, as Hogan was celebrating in the ring, King Kong Bundy came storming down the aisle. What followed was one of the most brutally effective angles the World Wrestling Federation had ever produced. Bundy hit Hogan with his signature avalanche in the corner. Then another. Then another. Then he splashed him. Then he splashed him again. The commentary from Vince McMahon and Jesse Ventura sold it as a legitimate attack. Hogan was not selling like a professional wrestler. He was selling like a man who had been genuinely hurt. When they finally cleared the ring, Hogan was carried out on a stretcher. his ribs supposedly broken, his championship reign in jeopardy for the first time in over 2 years. And then Bundy grabbed a microphone. He looked directly into the camera, and he told the world that he wanted Hulk Hogan. He wanted the championship. He wanted to finish what he had started. Kids across America were reportedly crying in front of their television sets that night because their hero had been broken. Their invincible champion had been rendered mortal, and the man who had done it was standing in the ring, unrepentant, demanding a title shot. The stage was set, and the venue Vince McMahon had chosen was going to be like nothing the wrestling business had ever attempted before. WrestleMania 1 had been held at Madison Square Garden. That was the safe move. But Vince did not believe in safe moves. For WrestleMania 2, he decided one city was not enough. He was going to run WrestleMania in 3 cities, simultaneously, on the same night. Broadcast live to closed-circuit venues all across North America. On paper, it sounded like genius. In practice, it was insanity. WrestleMania 2 took place on Monday, April 7, 1986. The first 4 matches ran out of the Nassau Coliseum in Uniondale, New York. The next 4 ran out of the Rosemont Horizon just outside Chicago. The final 4 ran out of the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena. Each venue had its own main event, its own commentary team, and its own celebrity host. Susan St. James called the New York show with Vince himself. Gorilla Monsoon and Gene Okerlund handled Chicago with actress Kathy Lee Crosby. Jesse Ventura, Lord Alfred Hayes, and horror movie host Elvira ran the Los Angeles broadcast. The Nassau Coliseum main event was the celebrity attraction, Mr. T versus Roddy Piper. But it was not a wrestling match. It was a boxing match, 4 2-minute rounds. And the reason was legitimate real-life animosity. Mr. T and Piper had genuinely hated each other since teaming as opponents at the first WrestleMania. Piper had reportedly told friends that he had been forced to protect Mr. T's terrible wrestling ability during their tag match, and he despised having to do it. When it came time to promote WrestleMania 2, Vince took that real-life hatred and turned it into a storyline. Joe Frazier, the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, was in Mr. T's corner. The match itself was a disaster. Piper eventually got frustrated, body-slammed Mr. T in the middle of the ring, and was disqualified in the 4th round. The Chicago main event was one of the strangest attractions ever booked at a WrestleMania, a 20-man battle royal. But not just any battle royal. Half the field was WWE wrestlers. The other half was National Football League players. Jimbo Covert of the Chicago Bears, Harvey Martin of the Dallas Cowboys, Ernie Holmes of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Bill Fralick of the Atlanta Falcons. The idea was that Chicago had just won the Super Bowl 2 months earlier, and Vince wanted to capitalize on the football fever gripping the city. André the Giant won it, last eliminating Bret Hart. But the match itself was clumsy and awkward, with football players who had no idea how to sell wrestling moves and wrestlers who had no idea how to interact with football players. And finally, out in Los Angeles, the actual World Championship main event. Hulk Hogan versus King Kong Bundy inside a steel cage. It was the first cage match in WrestleMania history. The cage itself was a new one, painted blue, built specifically for this match because the wrestlers of the era hated the old cages, which had too much give in them and hurt to climb. According to Bruce Pritchard, the wrestlers of that era started calling this new blue cage the Hulk and Bundy cage, because it was built for them. Hogan came to the ring with his ribs heavily taped. Bobby Heenan seconded Bundy. Bundy immediately ripped the tape off Hogan's ribs to expose the injury. And for the next 10 minutes, Hogan fought through the pain, took Bundy's biggest moves, survived the avalanche and the splash, then hulked up, hit the leg drop, and climbed the cage to retain his championship. After the match, he caught Bobby Heenan inside the cage and slammed his head into the steel wall before atomic dropping him onto the concrete outside. The Los Angeles crowd went absolutely nuclear. But here is the truth about WrestleMania 2. Critics did not love it. Historians do not remember it fondly. The 3-city format never happened again. The main events were considered underwhelming, and behind the scenes, the entire experiment had almost fallen apart before it even started. Because just weeks before the pay-per-view, In a locker room in Minneapolis, one man had gathered the entire World Wrestling Federation roster together and asked them to blow up WrestleMania 2 from the inside. His name was Jesse Ventura, and he wanted to start a union. The idea had come from a chance encounter in an elevator. Ventura had run into Gene Upshaw, the legendary offensive guard from the Oakland Raiders and the former head of the National Football League Players Association. Upshaw had looked at Ventura and told him, plain and simple, that wrestlers needed a union. In the world of the mid-1980s, professional wrestlers had no health insurance provided by their employers. They had no pension. They had no residuals from merchandise sales. Ventura was paying somewhere around $5,000 to $6,000 a year out of his own pocket just to insure his family. And that was Ventura, one of the highest-paid personalities in the company. The wrestlers below him were doing even worse. So Ventura called a meeting. Right before WrestleMania 2, every top ticket had already been sold. Every hotel had been booked. Every advertisement had been placed. Vince McMahon had bet the entire future of the company on this event, and Ventura recognized that this was the exact moment when the wrestlers had all the leverage in the world. His pitch to the locker room was blunt. He told them they needed to stick together. He told them that if they simply refused to wrestle until they were allowed to unionize, there was nothing Vince could do. He told them they did not even need every star to buy in. All they needed, he said, was King Kong Bundy, because Bundy was Hogan's opponent in the main event. If Bundy walked, WrestleMania 2 could not happen. And if they contacted the Charlotte wrestlers, the guys in Jim Crockett Promotions, they could turn it into an industry-wide movement and finally give professional wrestling the medical care and retirement benefits it desperately needed. Some of the wrestlers wanted in, others were nervous. And one man, according to Jesse Ventura, listened to the entire speech, said nothing, and then walked out of that locker room and immediately picked up a telephone. Hulk Hogan. According to Ventura's account, which he has repeated in interviews for decades since, Hulk Hogan called Vince McMahon and told him everything. The very next day, Ventura's phone rang. It was Vince. And Vince was furious. He threatened to have Ventura fired on the spot. He threatened to have him removed from his upcoming role in the film Predator. He made it absolutely clear that any further union talk would end Jesse Ventura's career in professional wrestling permanently. The union effort collapsed. There would not be another serious attempt to unionize a major American wrestling promotion for the next 40 years. When Jesse Ventura eventually returned to the WWE, he had signed with the Screen Actors Guild through his movie work, which gave him the health insurance and pension he had been fighting for. But the wrestlers he had tried to help were left with nothing. The independent contractor system Ventura tried to break in the spring of 1986 is, to this day, the system that governs professional wrestling. And the man he blamed for it, Hulk Hogan, was still the champion, still on top of the world. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Something that would set up the single most impactful angle of the entire year. Because in April of 1986, the largest wrestling attraction in the world simply disappeared. André the Giant did not show up. The setup had been playing out for weeks. Big John Studd and King Kong Bundy had been feuding with André for over a year. They challenged him on Piper's Pit to a tag team match. André accepted. But when the night arrived, André was not there. Hillbilly Jim showed up with the powerlifter Ted Arcidi as a replacement, and Studd and Bundy attacked them, drawing a disqualification. Heenan immediately launched a media campaign. He demanded WWE President Jack Tunney suspend André for no showing his commitments. Week after week, Heenan pushed the issue. Eventually, Tunney had no choice. André the Giant was suspended from the World Wrestling Federation on July 26, 1986. Except André had not really been fired. He had not been punished. What had happened was that André needed time off. Two reasons. The first was that André had been cast in a movie called The Princess Bride, which was filming in the United Kingdom that summer, and he needed months off to shoot it. The second was that André's health was deteriorating rapidly. The acromegaly that had made him 7 feet tall and over 500 pounds was now destroying his spine. He needed major back surgery, and after that surgery, His in-ring mobility was going to be permanently limited. WWE Creative needed a way to write him off television for months at a time without actually retiring him. Their solution was one of the most gloriously ridiculous angles ever produced in the World Wrestling Federation. They introduced a masked tag team from Japan called The Machines. The gimmick was inspired by a real Japanese wrestler named Super Strong Machine, who competed in New Japan Pro Wrestling wearing a metallic robotic mask. The WWE licensed the outfit for their own use, but their version had a twist. One of the machines was going to be André the Giant himself, hidden under a mask, working reduced schedules under an assumed identity so Bobby Heenan could not prove he was violating his suspension. The team was managed by Captain Lou Albano. Super Machine was Bill Eadie, previously the Masked Superstar. Big Machine was Blackjack Mulligan, and Giant Machine was Andre. The identities were, of course, completely obvious. Everyone in the arenas could tell exactly who was under the masks. Everyone at home could tell. The commentators pretended not to know, occasionally suggesting that maybe Giant Machine was actually Giant Baba from Japan. But nobody bought it. Nobody was supposed to buy it. That was the joke. Bobby Heenan spent months trying to prove the truth. He appeared on Jesse Ventura's Body Shop and introduced his own new team, supposedly from Korea. King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd walked out with paper bags over their heads. It was a live demonstration of how obvious the ruse was. Heenan pushed Jack Tunney to declare that if Giant Machine was ever proven to be Andre, the suspension would become permanent. He showed up at ringside with a camera, trying to take photographs. The machines expanded. Hulk Machine appeared for one night. Roddy Piper made a one-off appearance as Piper Machine, wearing a kilt with the metal mask. Even Reggie the Crusher Lisowski turned up in Milwaukee as Crusher Machine. Yeah, that's exactly what happened, but wait till you find out what happens next. But the whole time, hidden under one of those masks, Andre was quietly working shortened tag matches, gathering his strength, healing his back, and preparing for what would come next. Because behind the scenes, Vince McMahon was building towards something bigger than anyone in the wrestling business could have possibly imagined. The machines were not the endgame. The machines were the setup. And when Andre was finally reinstated in November of 1986, the story of how that reinstatement had been arranged was going to be revealed as the single most important storyline of the entire decade. But that was still months away. Because in the summer of 1986, an entirely different tragedy was unfolding in Hulk Hogan's world. His best friend was about to stab him in the back. Paul Orndorff had first come to the WWE in 1984. He had teamed with Roddy Piper at the very first WrestleMania on the losing side of the main event against Hogan and Mr. T. He had been the top villain in the company for over a year. But after WrestleMania 1, Orndorff had turned on his own teammates, split with Piper, and become a fan favorite. By the beginning of 1986, he had become one of the most popular wrestlers in the World Wrestling Federation. And Vince McMahon looked at that popularity and saw an opportunity. Because if Orndorff was popular enough to team with Hulk Hogan, then Orndorff was popular enough to betray Hulk Hogan. And that betrayal, done correctly, could be the biggest storyline the company had ever run. The buildup began in June. WWE Championship Wrestling started airing a new interview segment called The Flower Shop, hosted by the newly repackaged adorable Adrian Adonis. Adonis had been a leather-jacketed New York tough guy for years, but at the start of 1986, he had undergone a dramatic gimmick change. He had bleached his hair blonde, gained a significant amount of weight, and adopted an effeminate, garishly dressed persona designed specifically to draw heat from mainstream 1980s audiences. His new talk show set was decorated with pink flowers. And Adonis used that show, week after week, to plant seeds of doubt in Paul Orndorff's mind. Adonis started calling Orndorff by a new nickname, Hulk Jr. He suggested over and over that Orndorff had gone soft since teaming with Hogan, that Orndorff was living in the champion's shadow, that the fans were only cheering Orndorff because he was standing next to a bigger star, that Hogan was ignoring Orndorff, using him, treating him as a second banana. Bobby Heenan appeared on The Flower Shop and joined the campaign, needling Orndorff about the same theme. Then came the phone call. On an episode of Championship Wrestling, Paul Orndorff appeared for an interview and told the audience that he had been trying to reach his good friend Hulk Hogan on the telephone. He said Hogan had not been answering, that he had eventually gotten someone on the line, and that person had told him Hogan was too busy training to come to the phone. Orndorff pretended it was no big deal. But the seed had been planted. The fans could see it in his face. Adonis and He-Man had gotten inside his head. The following week, Hogan appeared on the show and accepted a tag team challenge on Orndorff's behalf. The two of them were going to face King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd, Heenan's Monsters, on the July 19th edition of Championship Wrestling. Orndorff, when he arrived, seemed off. Something was wrong. And during the match itself, something happened that fans of professional wrestling would talk about for the next 40 years. The match started normally. Hogan and Orndorff seemed to be on the same page. Then a botch happened. Hogan accidentally ran into Orndorff, staggering him. Orndorff sold it like an eye injury. He clutched his face, playing it up, staying on the apron. Bundy and Studd used the opportunity to double-team Hogan for an extended period. Vince McMahon on commentary began questioning why Orndorff was not tagging in, why he was not helping his friend, why he was letting Hogan take this beating. Finally, Orndorff entered the ring. He cleared the villains out. Hogan was down, exhausted, and Orndorff reached out to help him up. The crowd cheered. Orndorff smiled at Hogan. And then he took his forearm and drove it across Hulk Hogan's throat with every ounce of strength he had. The crowd froze. Vince McMahon on commentary lost his composure. Orndorff picked Hogan up and hit him with a piledriver in the middle of the ring. Then he cupped his hand behind his ear, flexed his muscles at the crowd, and openly mocked Hulk Hogan's signature routines. Bobby Heenan came running down the aisle. Orndorff embraced him. The Heenan family had a new member, and Hulk Hogan's best friend had just become the most hated man in professional wrestling. The angle was so effective, so shockingly well executed, that Pro Wrestling Illustrated later declared that this feud was the entire reason the magazine had created a Feud of the Year award in the first place. Paul Orndorff would win Most Hated Wrestler of 1986, ahead of Ric Flair. The storyline established a template that Vince McMahon would run again and again for decades. The friend turns on Hulk Hogan. The friend gets destroyed by Hulk Hogan. And every single time from Orndorff to Andre to Randy Savage, the formula would draw money. But nothing would draw money quite like the first one did. Orndorff took his heel turn to the next level almost immediately. He began using Hulk Hogan's own entrance theme, Real American, as his own theme music. He came to the ring flexing and posing exactly like Hogan did. He was, in every possible way, a twisted reflection of the champion, and the fans hated him for it. The two men wrestled a non-stop series of house shows across the summer and fall of 1986. Every arena they ran together, they sold out. And on August 28th, the biggest of them all took place in Toronto, in an outdoor stadium at the Canadian National Exhibition. The show was called The Big Event. It drew somewhere between 61,000 and 74,000 fans, setting a professional wrestling outdoor attendance record at the time. The Toronto Star had advertised the event with a single word on the poster: Hulkamania. The main event was Hogan versus Orndorff for the WWE Championship. Bobby Heenan was in Orndorff's corner. The match built through all the standard Hulk Hogan beats. Hogan got attacked before the bell. Hogan took a beating, Hogan hulked up, Hogan hit the leg drop. And just as it appeared that Orndorff had finally lifted the World Championship, Bobby Heenan interfered with a chair, and the referee disqualified Orndorff. Hogan retained. Orndorff, technically, had beaten Hogan for the belt, and the promoters cleverly played that up. It was ambiguous. It was frustrating. It made every single one of those 60+ thousand fans want to come back and see it settled properly. That settlement would come months later. On the December 14th taping of Saturday Night's Main Event, aired on NBC on January 3rd, 1987, Hogan and Orndorff finally met inside a steel cage. And in one of the most infamous finishes in wrestling history, both men escaped the cage at the exact same moment. Both feet hit the concrete floor simultaneously. Referee Joey Marella awarded the match to Hogan. Referee Danny Davis, playing up his crooked referee gimmick, awarded the match to Orndorff. Chaos followed. The match was restarted. Hogan eventually escaped clean and retained his championship. The feud, on television, was over. But Hogan had still never actually pinned Paul Orndorff in the middle of the ring. And that fact, that unfinished business, would linger over the World Wrestling Federation for years afterward. While Hulk Hogan was fighting for his life against Paul Orndorff, the second most important title in the company was being carried by a lunatic in fluorescent tights, whose ring introductions were accompanied by his gorgeous, mysterious wife. Randy Savage had arrived in the WWE in 1985 after years of running his father Angelo Poffo's independent territory in Kentucky and Tennessee. Vince McMahon had paraded every top manager in the company in front of him, offering to sign him. Savage had rejected all of them and instead introduced his own manager. She said nothing. She was stunningly beautiful. Her name, it was eventually revealed, was Miss Elizabeth, and she was Randy Savage's real-life wife. Elizabeth changed professional wrestling. Before her, valets and managers had been characters. Loud, colorful, interfering. Elizabeth was silent, elegant, terrified of her own husband. She created a level of storytelling the industry had never really seen, because every time Savage brutalized an opponent, the camera could cut to her face and communicate everything the audience needed to feel. On February 8, 1986, at the Boston Garden, Randy Savage defeated Tito Santana for the WWE Intercontinental Championship. He would hold that title for the next 414 days. And during that reign, the most popular storyline the company would run around the Intercontinental Championship was not really about the championship at all. It was about George the Animal Steele falling in love with Miss Elizabeth. Steele was a hulking, hairy, green-tongued madman who had been portrayed as a subhuman monster for most of his career. In early 1986, Steele saw Elizabeth for the first time at ringside, and something inside him melted. He became infatuated with her. He would try to protect her from her own husband. He would leave her flowers. He would carry her backstage when Savage was raging at her. The storyline was supposed to last a couple of months and end with Steele humiliated. But the fans loved it so much that it kept going and going and going. It carried through WrestleMania 2, where Savage defeated Steele in one of the New York matches to retain his Intercontinental title. It carried through the summer. It carried into 1987. And then, in the fall of 1986, the company began setting up a different challenger for Randy Savage. A former International Wrestling Association star from Hawaii who had made his name as one half of a legendary tag team in the Carolinas. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. The angle they built was as simple as it was cruel. On the November 22nd edition of Superstars, Steamboat challenged Savage for the Intercontinental Championship in the main event. Steamboat lost by countout, but the loss was not what mattered. What mattered was what happened afterwards. Savage attacked Steamboat outside the ring. He grabbed him and draped his throat across the steel guardrail. Then Savage climbed up to the apron and dropped a flying double axe handle from the top rope directly onto Steamboat's exposed windpipe. Steamboat rolled to the floor, clutching his throat, unable to breathe. But Savage was not done. He rolled Steamboat back into the ring. He picked up the ring bell, the heavy brass bell that the timekeeper used to signal the end of matches. He climbed to the top turnbuckle, and he dropped, driving the ring bell directly onto Ricky Steamboat's throat with all the weight of his body behind it. Steamboat was carried out of the arena on a stretcher. Vince McMahon on commentary was screaming that Steamboat could not breathe. "Look at him," Vince kept repeating. "He cannot breathe." The angle was so brutal that WWE began producing vignettes over the following weeks showing Ricky Steamboat at home, unable to speak, undergoing rehabilitation for what commentators referred to as a crushed larynx. It set up a revenge match that would eventually take place at WrestleMania 3 in Pontiac, Michigan, in front of over 90,000 people. And that match, Ricky Steamboat versus Randy Savage, would go on to be named the greatest match in WrestleMania history and one of the greatest professional wrestling matches ever performed. But the seeds of that legendary encounter had been planted in the autumn of 1986 on a Sunday afternoon television taping. with a brass ring bell and a body strewn across a guardrail. While the singles storylines dominated the headlines, the WWE Tag Team division was quietly having one of the greatest years in its history. WrestleMania 2 had seen the coronation of the British Bulldogs, Davey Boy Smith and the Dynamite Kid, as the new WWE Tag Team Champions. They had defeated the Dream Team of Brutus Beefcake and Greg the Hammer Valentine in Chicago, with rock legend Ozzy Osbourne in their corner. The Bulldogs represented something the WWE Tag Team division had never really had before: genuine athleticism, high-flying moves, a hard-hitting, technically brilliant style imported directly from the Stampede wrestling territory in Calgary. Right alongside them, another Stampede import was reshaping what a heel tag team could look like: the Hart Foundation. Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil. The Anvil, managed by Jimmy Hart. Smaller than the Bulldogs, but mean, quick, and versatile. The Rougeau brothers, Jacques and Raymond, came in from Montreal to provide a second high-flying babyface team. And underneath all of them, Demolition was being quietly assembled in the background, with Bill Eadie preparing to shed his Super Machine gimmick and become the face-painted powerhouse Axe, alongside Barry Darsow as Smash. Behind the scenes, however, 1986 was a year of significant turmoil. George Scott, the WWE's primary booker since 1983, left the company in the middle of the year. Scott had booked the rise of Hulkamania. He had booked WrestleMania 1. He had been central to the negotiations that let the WWE absorb parts of Stampede Wrestling and Georgia Championship Wrestling's television time slot. His departure marked the true beginning of Vince McMahon's total creative control. Captain Lou Albano, one of the pillars of the WWE managerial ranks since the 1970s, would leave at the end of the year. Jesse Ventura, following his failed union attempt, spent the middle of the year filming Predator in Mexico. He would return to Saturday night's main event commentary, but never fully wrestle again in the WWE at the same intensity. The superstar Billy Graham, comeback that had been planned for later in the year, in which the former Worldwide Wrestling Federation champion was reportedly going to return as some kind of kung fu character to challenge Randy Savage, fell apart when Graham re-injured his hip during the promotional videos. And Roddy Piper, one of the biggest stars in the company, took a leave of absence from the summer through the fall. He had signed on to star in the John Carpenter science fiction film They Live, and needed the time off for filming and pre-production. In his absence, Adrian Adonis's Flower Shop segment replaced Piper's Pit on Championship Wrestling. When Piper eventually returned in August, he was cheered for the first time in his WWE career during a squash match against a jobber named AJ Petrucci. And the rowdy Roddy Piper who returned from Hollywood was no longer a villain. He was, whether he wanted to be or not, a hero. That transition set up one of the strangest and most personal feuds of the entire year. Because when Piper came back to reclaim his talk show, he found it had been replaced by Adonis's Flower Shop. The two men spent weeks trading insults on television, with Piper attempting to reclaim his territory and Adonis mocking him from behind pink curtains. It culminated in a segment where the two shows aired simultaneously, with the sets literally next to each other. Piper's former bodyguard, Cowboy Bob Orton, who had been by Piper's side for years, walked away from Piper mid-segment and joined Adonis. Then Adonis, Orton, and Don Muraco attacked Piper, injured his leg, covered him in lipstick, and destroyed the original Piper's Pit set. A week later, Piper stormed the set of the Flower Shop with a baseball bat and destroyed it in front of a live studio audience. The angle was set. The feud would carry all the way to WrestleMania 3, culminating in one of the most memorable moments in that legendary event, a hair versus hair match that would end with Adrian Adonis being publicly shaved bald in the middle of the ring while his own manager Jimmy Hart was held down and forced to watch. But that finale was still months away, because in November of 1986, the biggest story in the entire company had nothing to do with Piper, nothing to do with Adonis, and nothing to do with any of the wrestlers who had actually been on television all year. André the Giant was coming back. The vignettes began airing on November 29, 1986. Footage was shown via satellite from London, England, Gary Davey was interviewing André, and the announcement was made. André the Giant had been reinstated to the World Wrestling Federation. His suspension was over. He was returning to active competition. The reasons behind his reinstatement were, at first, unclear. Jack Tunney offered vague explanations. André himself refused to say much. But over the following weeks, the truth began to leak out through Bobby Heenan's boasts on television. Bobby Heenan had arranged the reinstatement. The full explanation would not come until the new year, but the pieces began coming together in December. André appeared alongside Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan announced that André was now part of the Heenan family. And the reason, when it was finally revealed, would set up the single biggest match in the history of the World Wrestling Federation. Because Bobby Heenan had promised André something no other manager could promise him: a guaranteed shot at Hulk Hogan and the World Heavyweight Championship. On the biggest stage the wrestling business had ever built. In front of the largest audience North American professional wrestling would ever assemble. The plan for WrestleMania 3 was already in motion. André the Giant, undefeated for 15 years, was going to challenge Hulk Hogan for the championship. The Pontiac Silverdome had been booked. The advertising was already being prepared. And when André appeared on Piper's Pit in January of 1987, tearing off his shirt and his crucifix, and telling Hulk Hogan that he was coming for the belt, the wrestling business would enter a new era. In December of 1986, the last major event of the year on the WWE calendar was the Saturday night's main event taping that gave us the Hogan-Orndorff cage match finale. The company that had entered 1986 as an ambitious upstart was ending the year as a genuine media empire. Saturday night's main event was drawing consistent 9 and 10 Nielsen ratings. WWE Superstars of Wrestling had launched in September and was quickly becoming the most watched syndicated wrestling program in North America. Merchandising was through the roof. Hulkamania t-shirts, LJN wrestling toys, ice cream bars, coloring books, and Saturday morning cartoons were flooding the retail market. The tour schedule was punishing every wrestler on the roster, but it was generating more money than professional wrestling had ever generated in its history. And underneath all of that success, the wrestling industry as a whole was collapsing. World-class championship. Wrestling in Texas was in a downward spiral, hit by the deaths and injuries of the Von Erich family, alongside the collapsing Texas oil economy. Bill Watts had renamed Mid-South Wrestling as the Universal Wrestling Federation in March in an attempt to compete nationally, but the strain was already showing. The American Wrestling Association was hemorrhaging talent to Vince McMahon almost every month. Only Jim Crockett Promotions, based out of Charlotte, was still standing as a real competitor. And Jim Crockett was fighting for his life against Vince McMahon every single day. By the end of 1986, the WWE had done something no wrestling company in North American history had ever done before. It had transcended its own industry. It was no longer just a wrestling company competing with other wrestling companies. It was a mainstream entertainment brand competing for eyeballs against sitcoms, sports broadcasts, and Hollywood movies. The transformation was permanent. The wrestling business, as it had existed for nearly 70 years, was dying. And 1986 was the year it finally admitted it was dying. For the wrestlers themselves, 1986 was a year of consequences they would not fully understand until much later. Paul Orndorff would spend the rest of his career battling arm injuries from the punishing house show schedule of the Hogan feud. His arm would visibly atrophy in the years to come. Dynamite Kid would take physical punishment during 1986 that would leave him crippled by his 40s. Bret Hart, Randy Savage, and Roddy Piper would all emerge from the year as bigger stars than they had ever been. And Hulk Hogan would emerge as, whether the wrestlers who worked with him liked it or not, the single most valuable performer the American entertainment industry had ever produced. The World Wrestling Federation in 1986 was a study in contrasts. On television, it was the greatest show on earth. Behind the curtain, it was a machine that ground human beings into dust to feed the ambitions of one very driven promoter in Stamford, Connecticut.